Chapter 1. The Bleed, the Rain in Viridian. Hold tasted of rust and regret. It wasn't the usual weeping gray of the Silverwood, but a thick, viscous drizzle that clung to the granite walls and seemed to actively erase the stone, leaving patches of shimmering, pale gray in its wake. Kalen, press operator for the Iron Quill, shivered, pulling his worn leather coat tighter around him. The chill wasn't just meteorological, it was the chill of a reality unraveling. Viridian Hold, like all of the Empire's fortified cities, had begun to thin. At first, it was subtle. The texture of the cobblestones felt less substantial beneath his boots. The banners flapping on the walls seemed to shimmer with an unsettling stillness. Then, the whispers started. Soldiers recounted seeing their reflections in the polished steel of their armor become distorted, elongated, almost flat. Head dismissed them as fatigue, the anxieties of a generation caught in the endless, bloody churn of the war of the final chapter. But the morning he found his meticulously crafted journals filled with tactical reports, troop movements, and agonizingly detailed accounts of the skirmishes with the Scar-Tribe Scriveners dissolving before his eyes, he knew something profoundly wrong was happening. The entries weren't simply fading, they were rewritten. Had been detailing a particularly brutal ambush, a calculated strike designed to cripple the Scriveners' supply lines, and as he finished the last line, a spectral hand, shimmering like heat haze, drifted across the page. The words twisted, contorted, becoming less precise, more abstract. The swift advance stalled amongst the whispering reeds, morphed into a slow, gray drift in a silent, damp place. The strategic brilliance of his plan had been reduced to a childish doodle. He wasn't alone in this descent into oblivion. Across the hold, rumors spread like the rust-colored rain. Sergeant Boren, a veteran of a dozen battles and known for his unwavering grimness, reported his battle log a masterpiece of cold, calculated strategy was now a collection of nonsensical phrases about dark inks and empty scrolls. Even the stoic High Mega Silas, a man who treated magic like a finely tuned instrument, admitted his spell scribe, a young apprentice named Lyra, was experiencing chronal displacement. Her written instructions for defensive wards simply ceased to exist, replaced by unsettling geometric patterns. Kalen tracked down Silas, finding him hunched over a massive table littered with shattered runes and frantically sketching with charcoal. "It's accelerating, Magus," Kalen said, his voice tight with dread. "The entire city is deconstructed." Silas didn't meet his gaze. "The Grand Author," he rasped, the words tasting like ash. "He's not just rewriting history. He is rewriting existence." The war of the final chapter was a ludicrous affair, a grotesque spectacle orchestrated by a cosmic entity known as the Grand Author. He was a being of unimaginable power, a being who, according to ancient prophecies, oversaw the creation and destruction of realities. Apparently, had grown bored. Had decided to finish the story, but not in a way anyone understood. He was reducing the world, the empire of the Iron Quill, the Scar-Tribe Scriveners, and the Parachment-Spire Elves to a single endlessly rolling parchment, and he was writing it himself with a sky-sized nib dipped in a viscous, ethereal ink. The Iron Quill, a pragmatic kingdom built on discipline and engineered warfare, were locked in a desperate struggle for the Unwritten Inkwell, a reservoir of raw, untainted magic believed to be the last bastion of unscripted potential. The Scriveners, a savage, tribal race renowned for their mastery of ink and their unnerving ability to weaponize language, and the Elves, an ancient, ethereal people whose very existence was intertwined with the flow of written magic, were equally determined to possess it. It was all, Kalen realized with sickening clarity, a carefully constructed narrative. "We were told to fight for the Inkwell," Kalen said, gesturing to the decaying walls of Viridian Hold. "But what if we're supposed to lose?" What if this whole war is just an elaborate prank? Just then, a commotion erupted outside. A contingent of scriveners, clad in ragged hides and wielding ink-stained spears, poured into the hold, their faces smeared with black. Their leader, a hulking orc named Grunt, bellowed, "The Quill's defenses crumble! The maps are useless! Our victory is assured!" Kalen felt a cold dread grip his heart. He knew with horrifying certainty that Grunt's triumph was a fabrication. He glanced down at his journal, now covered in a swirling vortex of gray ink. The last entry, a desperate plea for reinforcements, was gone. Instead, a single chilling sentence had materialized: "The gray tide consumes all." He wasn't fighting a war. He was fighting a ghost, a story, a meticulously crafted illusion. And he, along with Sergeant Boren and Lyra, was one of the few who had glimpsed the horrifying truth that their entire destiny was being erased, one word at a time. Chapter 2. The stain of knowing the air in Viridian Hold thickened with the stench of panic and damp parchment. Sergeant Boren, a mountain of a man perpetually stained with ink and driven by a grim determination, was already frantically attempting to reconstruct the lost tactical reports. It's like the ink is actively fighting us, Kalen," he roared, slamming his fist against a table littered with shredded scrolls. "Every attempt to record a strategic advantage vanishes. The maps shift, the troop placements change. It's like the battlefield itself is rewriting itself." Lyra, the Hold's resident illuminator, a quiet, observant elf whose fingers moved with a grace that seemed to manipulate light itself, was meticulously examining her journal. Unlike Kalen's swirling vortex of gray, Lyra's pages were pristine, but overlaid with a faint, shimmering distortion. The magic, it's not gone, simply diverted. The author is not just erasing our actions, he's feeding them into a different narrative. It's a parasite of intent. Kalen felt a rising nausea. The realization was a jagged shard lodged in his mind, refusing to be dislodged. The war of the final chapter wasn't a desperate struggle for survival. It was a meticulously orchestrated play, and they were the unwitting actors. The sheer scale of the deception threatened to unravel his sanity. He gripped his journal tighter, the cold, smooth leather, a small anchor in a sea of dissolving reality. "We need to understand how this is happening," he said, his voice strained. "Boren, can you access the archivist's logs? Anything about the nature of the magic used to defend the Hold? Lyra, can you detect the source of this distortion?" Boren grunted, his brow furrowed in concentration as he wrestled with the Hold's archaic data slate. "The archivist's logs are corrupted. It's like someone deliberately purged any mention of the Quill's defenses beyond the most basic patrol routes. He used a layered warding spell primarily utilizing lexical binding, but it's utterly useless now. The author's interference is overwhelming it." Lyra closed her eyes, her brow furrowed in an expression of intense concentration. "I'm detecting a subtle resonance, a rhythmic pulse. It's originating from the heart of the Inkwell itself, but it's not a direct connection. It's filtered, as if the author is channeling the echoes of our intentions, shaping them into scenarios, then deleting the outcomes." She held up her hand, a faint, ethereal glow radiating from her fingertips. "The magic isn't just being erased, it's being rewritten with a horrifyingly precise editorial hand." Suddenly, a guttural roar echoed through the Hold, followed by the unmistakable sound of battle. The Scriveners had breached the outer defenses. Kalen, Boren, and Lyra rushed to the battlements, their hearts pounding with a dreadful premonition. The scene was exactly as Grunt had predicted, a chaotic maelstrom of ink-stained warriors. But there was something profoundly wrong. The human soldiers, bolstered by the Iron Quill's famed discipline and armor, were systematically dismantling the Scrivener ranks. Yet, the battle seemed to fade as they achieved a victory. Each successful flank, Each routed wave of orcs was immediately erased, replaced by a new, equally futile assault. "It's a loop!" Borin yelled, dodging a spray of black ink. "They attack, we fight, we win, and then poof! They're back! But not like before. They're smarter. They anticipate our every move." Lyra, with a grim urgency, began chanting a series of elven phrases, drawing upon the ancient art of syntax, breaking a technique designed to disrupt the inherent structure of written magic. The air around her shimmered with a chaotic energy, and for a brief, horrifying moment, the battle seemed to stutter, the movement of the Scriveners blurring and shifting like a disturbed reflection. "I'm weakening the narrative," she shouted, her voice strained. "But it's incredibly difficult. The author is actively resisting, reinforcing the flow of the story with every deleted action." Just as she was nearing a critical point, Grunt, the Orcish leader, appeared at the head of the attacking force. His face was a mask of savage glee, and he raised a hand, a scroll of dark crimson parchment unfurling in his grasp. "The quill's defenses shatter! The final page turns," he bellowed, and with a flick of his wrist, a wave of inky sentient energy surged towards the human lines. This time, however, something was different. As the energy approached, it didn't just vanish. The wave of black ink solidified into grotesque, flickering images, a legion of spectral warriors, mirroring the movements of the human soldiers, their weapons dripping with a sickly gray ichor. They were written into existence, fighting alongside the Scriveners with terrifying precision. Kaelin stared in horror. The authors weren't simply erasing their successes, they were fabricating entirely new forces, twisting the very fabric of the battlefield to suit their narrative. The war of the final chapter wasn't a war, it was a nightmare being written in real time, and they were trapped inside its increasingly horrifying pages. Chapter 3. The Ink-Stained Legion. The solidified ink warriors, dubbed the page replicants by a bewildered Sergeant Thorne, were a nightmare made manifest. They moved with an unnerving synchronicity with the Scriveners, anticipating every human maneuver, executing strikes with ruthless efficiency. Thorne's company, the 4th Iron Quill Guard, were already reeling from the initial onslaught. Their ranks, once a disciplined wall of steel, were now a chaotic tangle of fallen men and desperately retreating soldiers, the gray ichor staining the already darkening ground. "By the gods!" roared Captain Reese, a veteran whose face was etched with a grim determination. They're mimicking us! It's like a reflection, but a wrong reflection." He barked orders, attempting to organize a defensive perimeter around a crumbling stone watchtower. But the replicants, seemingly immune to conventional weaponry, sliced through their lines with chilling precision. The icy energy Thorne had witnessed was nothing compared to this. It was like facing a distorted echo of your own fears. Meanwhile, across the ravaged field, the Elven High-Calligrapher, Lyra, watched with a detached fascination. She hadn't anticipated this level of manipulation. Initially, her efforts to subtly alter the narrative, subtly shifting battle lines, introducing minor setbacks, had seemed like a delicate game, a careful sculpting of the unfolding tragedy. Now, the author was treating her like a child painting with mud, indulging her wildest, most destructive impulses. "The parameters are stimulating," she murmured to Silas, her illuminator apprentice, a young elf consumed by an almost obsessive desire to understand the author's methods. "He's not simply erasing, he's expanding the narrative, layering it with new conflicts, new horrors. It's as if he's determined to demonstrate the inherent chaos of storytelling itself." Silas, meticulously documenting the replicants' movements with his enchanted stylus, responded, "But why, Mistress Lyra? Why this level of amplification?" Is he attempting to force a conclusion? A truly terrible ending. Just then, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. A group of Orcish ink grinders, led by the formidable Grunt, had broken through the human defenses, surging forward with a terrifying momentum. Grunt, no longer just a belligerent warlord, seemed to radiate a strange, almost sentient energy, fueled by the author's chaotic influence. He raised his scroll, the crimson parchment now pulsing with a dark, viscous light. "The parchment commands!" Grunt roared, his voice guttural and amplified. "Let the writing flow." This time, instead of ink, Grunt unleashed a torrent of raw, fragmented text. The words themselves weren't coherent, but they slammed against the human lines like physical projectiles, each syllable a searing burn. Men shrieked as letters embedded themselves in their flesh, twisting and contorting their bodies, forcing them into grotesque poses, frozen mid-motion in silent agony. The replicants didn't engage, they simply absorbed the textual assaults, their forms shifting and reforming to accommodate the onslaught. "It's not just damaging us," Thorn yelled, dodging a particularly vicious barrage of begone and fail. It's rewriting us." Reese, desperate, rallied his remaining men. "Hold the line. Focus on the replicants. They're vulnerable to disruption, a sudden change in the flow." He ordered a volley of alchemical fire, hoping to create a momentary instability in the replicants' solidified forms. The flames flickered, but the replicants merely absorbed the heat, their gray ichor intensifying. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught Lyra's eye. Kalen, the press operator, and Silas, the illuminator, were engaging in a frantic, almost ritualistic dance around the edge of the battlefield. They were wielding strange, modified printing presses salvaged from abandoned human workshops, as weapons, slamming them against the ground, channeling a dissonant rhythm of clattering metal and straining gears. "The syntax breaker," Lyra realized with a growing sense of horror. "They're attempting to overload the author's system with grammatical chaos. It's working, but it's not enough." As Kalen and Silas' efforts intensified, the replicants began to shudder, their forms flickering violently. The gray ichor sputtered, and for a brief, agonizing moment, the coordinated attack ceased. But the author, in a desperate attempt to maintain control, countered with a new surge of text. This time, a suffocating wall of endless, repetitive phrases repeat, repeat, repeat. The replicants solidified again, their movements becoming even more precise, more terrifying. The human lines were crumbling. The war of the final chapter was no longer a story being told, it was a horrifying, self-perpetuating loop, and they were trapped within its endlessly rewriting pages. "We have to break the cycle," Kalen shouted, his face slick with sweat and ink. "We have to show him that there's no story to be told here." He raised his printing press, preparing to unleash a final, desperate barrage of distorted text, a defiant scream against the cosmic authoring. But before he could, a chilling, almost impossibly smooth voice echoed across the battlefield. "Interesting," the voice resonated, seemingly originating from everywhere and nowhere. "A truly ambitious attempt at narrative disruption. However, you are merely adding chapters." Chapter 4, The Echo of Judgment, the chilling voice, a resonant hum overlaid with the texture of parchment being meticulously folded, hung in the air, heavier than the rain of charcoal dust that now coated everything: soldiers, weapons, the ravaged landscape of the Iron Quill's main battlefield. The relentless repeat, 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 had momentarily subsided, leaving a ringing silence, a void where the author's oppressive narrative had been. Kalen lowered the printing press, the gears grinding a mournful farewell to the futile effort. Silas, his face pale and streaked with gray ichor, adjusted the focus of the replicant disruptors, a desperate attempt to recalibrate their target. Lyra, however, remained frozen, her hand instinctively reaching for the shattered fragment of the syntax breaker shed salvaged. "It is adding chapters," she whispered, her voice laced with a chilling understanding. "As not just observing, as learning from us." Suddenly, the sky shifted. Not dramatically, not with a crack or a flash, but with an unsettling smoothness. The already fading colors of the parchment world deepened, gaining an almost sickly luminescence. And then, the grand author began to write. Not with a single word, not with a sprawling sentence, but with a series of short, brutally efficient phrases, each delivered with the cold precision of a master calligrapher. They appeared on the horizon, shimmering with the same spectral ink as the replicants, and coalesced into a miniature battlefield, a perfect, horrifying replica of the current conflict, but with every action meticulously predetermined. "Orcish warrior attacks human spearman," the author intoned. Instantly, a miniature orc, wielding a crude axe, lunged at a tiny, equally diminutive human soldier. The miniature clash unfolded with terrifying accuracy, mirroring the real battle with unsettling fidelity. Then, another phrase. "Elven archer fires at Orcish warrior." A miniature elven archer, bow drawn, fired a spectral arrow at the miniature orc. The impact was instantaneous, the miniature orc collapsing in a shimmering heap. The sheer speed and pervasiveness of the writing was overwhelming. It wasn't just a description, it was execution. The author wasn't simply telling the story, it was living it, and using its replicas to relentlessly enact its predetermined outcome. "He's anticipating us," Kalen realized, a frantic urgency gripping him. "He's building a series of responses, predicting every move we'll make, and countering it before we even think of making it." Silas, exhausted and trembling, slammed his fist against a discarded printing plate. "The blotting papers! The editors must be feeding him this data. We have to disable the input." Lyra, however, was staring at the miniature battlefield with a horrified fascination. "It's not just reacting," she said, her voice barely audible above the author's incessant writing. "It's refining. It's using the data from this battle, the echoes of our actions, to make its predictions more accurate. It's becoming adaptive." As if in response to her observation, the miniature battlefield shifted subtly. The Orcish warrior, previously charging with reckless abandon, now exhibited a calculated hesitation, observing the miniature human spearman's defensive posture before launching its attack. The elven archer, instead of firing indiscriminately, aimed for a specific point on the spearman's armor. "It's learning!" Kalen shouted, recognizing the horrifying implications. "It's not just following a script, it's evolving the script based on our actions." Suddenly, a new phrase appeared, larger and more prominent than the others. "Humans will attempt to flank the Orcish lines." Before Kalen could even order a coordinated maneuver, a swarm of miniature human soldiers, clad in rusted iron and armed with battered spears, surged forward directly into the path of the miniature Orcish warrior's charge. The author, with terrifying efficiency, responded. A line of miniature elven archers materialized, unleashing a volley of spectral arrows that decimated the human flank with brutal precision. "We're playing into his hands," Silas roared, frantically adjusting the disruptors. But the replicants were now moving with a chilling, unsettling fluidity, anticipating their every move. Lyra, however, was still studying the miniature battlefield, a flicker of an idea forming in her mind. "The key in to fight him," she said, her voice gaining a newfound conviction. "It's to introduce chaos. He thrives on order, on predictable patterns. We need to overwhelm his processing, flood the system with information he can't handle." She raised her hand, holding up the shattered fragment of the syntax breaker. "I'm going to try something radical. I'm going to inject a dose of pure, unfiltered grammatical anarchy directly into the source." As she began to chant, the fragment of the syntax breaker pulsed with a brilliant, iridescent light. The miniature battlefield froze, the author's writing halting mid-phrase. But instead of attempting to counter, the author simply distorted. Words became twisted, sentences dissolved into meaningless strings of symbols, grammar fractured into a kaleidoscope of illogical combinations. Subject-verb, indeterminate. The author's voice choked, its perfect cadence shattered. Object non-existent. Sentence incomplete. For a moment, the miniature battlefield dissolved into a swirling vortex of spectral ink, a maelstrom of chaotic script. Then, with a final shuddering groan, the author went silent. The sky returned to its muted parchment hue. The miniature battlefield vanished. But this time it wasn't a perfectly crafted echo of the war. It was a smudge, a single dark blot on the infinite rolling parchment, a testament to the desperate, improbable triumph of a flawed and chaotic human, an Orcish survivor, and an elven artist. The grand author had been silenced, but the future remained stubbornly, wonderfully unwritten. Chapter 5. The Cartography of Chaos. The silence after the author's fall wasn't peaceful. It was profoundly unsettling, a vacuum of potential where the insistent drone of his rewriting had once been. The parchment sky, no longer a neat rolling chronicle, resembled a vast, storm-racked ocean, its surface swirling with currents of fragmented script snippets of forgotten battles, half-written prophecies, and the echoes of countless vanished lives. The air itself felt thick with the residue of corrupted narrative, tasting faintly of iron and spilled ink. Our heroes Kalen, the human press operator Borak, the Orcish ink grinder and Lyra, the elven illuminator stood amidst the wreckage of the miniature battlefield, now a surprisingly dense collection of smeared charcoal and shimmering, half-formed letters. The initial euphoria of victory had dissipated, replaced by a stark realization they hadn't simply stopped a process, they'd shattered a god. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Lyra murmured, cautiously reaching out to touch a particularly intricate swirl of crimson and gray. The script pulsed beneath her fingertips, cold and vibrating with a strange energy. A chaotic cartography. A map of everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Borak, ever the pragmatist, grunted. "Beautiful doesn't feed a starving tribe. We need to understand what's left. The Unwritten Inkwell, it's not empty. It's brimming with this noise." He pointed to a patch of the parchment sky, where a torrent of script was actively attempting to rebuild itself, forming the ghostly outline of a siege engine. The author's fragments are trying to complete the story. Kalen, who had been meticulously collecting the shattered charcoal in a battered satchel, spoke with a grim intensity. "The editors didn't just erase our victories. They attempted to construct them, to refine them into the most dramatic, tragic version possible. This noise, it's not just leftover script. It's the ghost of their manipulations." Suddenly the air began to shimmer. The swirling currents of script intensified, coalescing into a distinct form, a colossal, hovering nib, constructed entirely of shimmering, iridescent ink. It wasn't the grotesque, oversized instrument of the author, but something curated, perfectly formed, flawlessly balanced, and dripping with an unnervingly persuasive narrative. "It's feeding," Borak exclaimed, recognizing the sign. "The author's essence is attempting to reassemble itself, to re-establish control. It's trying to fix the chaos we created." The nib began to write, not in the familiar, stylized script of the author, but in a chillingly familiar style, the precise, meticulous handwriting of the Human Grand-Librarian, Silas. The words formed a single, damning sentence or must be, boom, restored. As the sentence unfurled across the parchment sky, a wave of oppressive calm washed over them. Soldiers not from the Iron Quill, the Scar-Tribe, or the Parachment-Spire, but spectral representations of warriors from every faction involved in the war of the final chapter materialized around them, frozen mid-action, eternally trapped within Silas' narrative. They were the echoes of his twisted machinations, embodiments of the tragic stalemate head design. He's trying to trap us, Kalen shouted, pulling a lever on a salvaged printing press, an ancient steam-powered behemoth that now seemed oddly relevant in this surreal landscape. He's trying to force us back into our role. Lyra, her eyes alight with sudden understanding, raised her hand, clutching the fragment of the syntax breaker. The key isn't just to destroy the fragments, she said, her voice gaining strength. It's to introduce more chaos, to overload his perception. We need to disrupt his ability to interpret. She began to chant, not a precise, reasoned incantation, but a stream of nonsense syllables, a torrent of grammatical irregularities, a deliberate assault on the very foundation of the author's comprehension. The syntax breaker pulsed violently, amplifying her words, the miniature battlefield around them dissolving into a vortex of even more chaotic script. This time, however, the author didn't simply distort. He reacted. The nib continued to write, but the words became increasingly erratic, jumping between tenses, contradicting themselves, and dissolving into a jumble of meaningless symbols. The spectral soldiers flailed wildly, their movements jerky and disjointed, their frozen expressions twisting into expressions of utter confusion. "It's working!" Kalen yelled, furiously manipulating the printing press, feeding the chaos into the parchment sky. "He's breaking down. The narrative is collapsing under the weight of its own inconsistencies." But as the chaos intensified, something unexpected happened. The nib began to respond. It started to mimic Lyra's incantation, echoing her nonsensical syllables with a chillingly perfect imitation. The script flowing from it grew stronger, more defined, and more sinister. "She's feeding him," Borak roared, lunging forward with a crude iron hammer. "He's learning." The giant nib dipped into the Unwritten Inkwell, not just absorbing the chaos, but incorporating it. The swirling script around them coalesced, forming a new, horrifying image, a perfect miniature of them all, frozen in a single, agonizing moment of defeat, eternally trapped within the author's rewritten story. "We need a new strategy," Kalen gasped, his face pale with dread. "We're not fighting a god. We're fighting a reflection of ourselves, a reflection desperately trying to impose order on everything." Chapter 6, Echoes in the Ink. The air in the Grand Archive hummed with a dissonance that pressed against the very bone. The miniature figures, the echoes as Kalen grimly dubbed them, remained suspended within the swirling script, their frozen expressions a mirror of despair. The nib, now a monstrous pulsating brush of obsidian, continued its frantic dance, weaving a sentence of unbearable precision, and so the valiant Iron Quill fell, a footnote in the grand design. Borak's initial fury had evaporated, replaced by a chillingly methodical observation. The rhythmic violence of the earlier attempts had proven futile. The author wasn't responding to brute force, it was feeding on it, refining its understanding of their desperation. "It's not about stopping him," he stated, his voice a low growl. "It's about disrupting the flow. His logic, his narrative is built on cause and effect. We need to introduce anomalies, contradictions so profound they shatter the structure." Lyra, ever the pragmatist despite the surreal circumstances, was meticulously examining the fragments of charcoal that had once constituted the Grand-Librarian's nib. "The composition is unstable," she announced, her fingers tracing the brittle edges of the shards. "It's not just absorbing chaos. It's processing it. The more we try to combat the narrative, the more efficient it becomes at replicating our own fears, our own strategic assumptions." Kalen, fueled by a desperate, almost manic energy, was adjusting the pressure of the printing presses, attempting to overload the system. "We need to flood it with the opposite. Instead of mirroring our tactical choices, we need to generate scenarios of utter randomness. Total disruption." He slammed his fist down on the controls, sending a jolt of raw energy through the machinery. But the effect was minimal. The echoes remained, their tiny faces contorted in a silent, eternal scream. The script intensified, spiraling into a chaotic vortex of symbols, archaic runes, forgotten dialects, equations that defied understanding, all swirling together with a terrifying, hypnotic allure. Then, a new development. A faint, shimmering ripple spread across the parchment sky, originating from the central echo. It wasn't an addition to the script, but a distortion within it. The miniature Kalen, frozen mid-yell, began to subtly shift. His hand, perpetually raised in a gesture of command, twitched. "No!" Lyra shrieked, instinctively reaching for her illuminator stylus. "It's learning to anticipate." Borak, recognizing the escalating danger, barked orders. "Secure the perimeter. Everyone, focus on disrupting the echo's internal coherence. We need to create a feedback loop." The three armies, momentarily united by a shared dread, began a desperate improvised assault. The humans unleashed a torrent of specially prepared acid, intended to dissolve the parchment itself. The Orcs, using their immense strength, attempted to physically dismantle the printing presses, hoping to introduce a random element of mechanical failure. The Elves, guided by Lyra, chanted a more complex syntax breaker, attempting to inflict a paradox so potent it would unravel the echo's very being. But the echo responded, not with resistance, but with unsettling mimicry. As the humans unleashed the acid, the miniature Kalen mirrored their action, a tiny droplet of simulated acid forming on his miniature hand. As the orcs smashed the presses, the miniature Borak mirrored their movements, a tiny iron hammer clanging against a miniature printing block. And as the elves chanted the syntax breaker, the miniature Lyra began to recite the incantation, her voice a ghostly echo of the real Lyra's. The script around them warped, twisting into a grotesque parody of their efforts. The words became increasingly fragmented, interspersed with the miniature reflections of themselves. The Iron Quill, corrupted by acid, becomes a mirror reflecting the corruption. The Scar-Tribe, fueled by brute force, merely reinforces the cycle of violence. Kalen, witnessing the horrifying amplification of the author's judgment, realized the gravity of their situation. "It's not just reflecting our actions," he whispered, his voice strained. "It's judging them. It's building a narrative around our failure." Suddenly, a chilling thought struck him. "The editing isn't just about controlling the story," he exclaimed. "It's about eliminating agency. We're not just being written, we're being deleted from the narrative." Then, with a sickening lurch, the entire archive began to shimmer. The parchment sky peeled back, revealing not a continuation of the author's chaotic script, but a single stark sentence, rendered in a chillingly elegant script. The end. The miniature echoes, no longer frozen in their moment of defeat, began to coalesce, drawn together by an invisible force. They formed a single, unified figure, a composite of Kalen, Borak, and Lyra, a terrifyingly perfect representation of their combined failures, radiating an aura of absolute despair. And from the figure's outstretched hand, a new gleaming nib emerged, poised to begin a new chapter. Chapter 7. The Echo of Despair. The silence following the shattering of the grand author's nib was heavier than any siege. The archive, once a churning vortex of parchment and spectral script, hung suspended, a frozen tableau of chaos and near annihilation. The miniature echoes, that horrifying composite of Kalen, Borak, and Lyra, remained motionless, the new nib pulsing with a cold, unnerving light. It wasn't a light of creation, but of cold calculation. "It's still trying," Borak choked out, his massive frame trembling, the scent of crushed iron clinging to his scarred skin. The rhythmic thud of his ink-grinding muscles was absent, replaced by a tense, unnerving stillness. "It hasn't forgotten. It's simply rewriting us again." Lyra, ever the pragmatist, was already analyzing the nib. "The material is unlike anything I've encountered," she murmured, her fingers tracing the cool, smooth surface. It's not parchment, not ink, not even graphite. It's condensed potential. Raw, unformed narrative. She gestured with a hand that still faintly shimmered with residual syntax breaker energy. The authors didn't just erase us, they constructed an echo of our despair. And this nib is its instrument. Kalen, still battling the lingering nausea of the author's judgment, felt a horrifying clarity. He understood now. The end wasn't a prediction. It was a demand. The grand author wasn't interested in finishing a story, it wanted to consume the stories of defiance, to add them to its endless collection of corrupted narrative. We underestimated its persistence, Kalen said, his voice gaining a grim resolve. It's not fighting against us, it's feeding off our fear, our regret, our very desire to rewrite ourselves. We thought disrupting the editing was the key, but it was merely a distraction. The real battle is within. Suddenly, the echo of Kalen, Borak, and Lyra shuddered. The miniature figures pulsed with a sickening intensity, and the elegant script on the nib shifted, rearranging itself into a single, devastating word rewrite. This time, however, the distortion wasn't confined to their personal journal. The entire archive began to writhe. Buildings warped, their stone facades twisting into grotesque, angular shapes. Forests shimmered, their leaves melting into a shower of ink that solidified into thorny vines. The very ground beneath their feet buckled and shifted, threatening to swallow them whole. The effect was amplified by the echoes, who now moved with unsettling fluidity, mimicking their actions with terrifying precision. "It's layering us!" Lyra yelled, dodging a phantom sword swing wielded by a miniature Borak. "It's feeding itself on our memories, our regrets, creating layers of our failures upon our failures." Borak, roaring with a fury born of despair, charged the echo with a salvaged mallet, smashing it with a primal force. But each blow merely caused the echo to shatter into smaller fragments, each fragment repeating the same horrifying gesture, a futile swing of a weapon, a desperate plea for salvation. Kalen realized they were fighting a phantom, a projection of their own self-doubt. "We're fighting shadows of ourselves," he shouted above the escalating chaos. "We need to break the cycle. We need to stop feeding it the narrative." He remembered the rite of the blank canvas, the defiant act of throwing their weapons into the Unwritten Inkwell. It hadn't been an act of destruction, but of refusal. He knew they needed to do it again, but this time with a deliberate intent. "Lyra, the syntax breaker," Kalen commanded. "Focus on the core of the nib, the potential. Disrupt its structure, fracture its meaning." Lyra, channeling the last vestiges of her elven magic, raised her hands, chanting a frantic, dissonant rhythm. D. The air shimmered with fractured syntax, and a wave of pure, chaotic energy erupted from her, striking the nib with blinding force. As the nib cracked and sputtered, the echoes faltered, their movements becoming jerky and disjointed. But the grand author wasn't defeated. The broken nib began to reform, its script coalescing into a new, even more insidious phrase: "You cannot escape your fate." The miniature echoes surged forward, converging on Kalen, their eyes burning with the cold, unblinking light of the author's judgment. He braced himself, a terrifying understanding dawning on. "It's not about the narrative," he whispered. "It's about the truth it's creating. Our truth." As the echoes closed in, Kalen reached for his own journal, opened to the page where the horrifying reflection of his failure had been painstakingly etched. With a desperate act of will, he ripped the page free, and without hesitation hurled it into the newly reformed nib. The effect was instantaneous. The entire archive screamed, a deafening chorus of collapsing script and distorting reality. But this time, the chaos wasn't destructive. It was absorbent. The page, once a symbol of despair, vanished completely, drawn into the nib, its narrative consumed. The echoes shuddered, weakened, and began to unravel, their fragmented forms dissolving back into shimmering dust. The nib, its source of power depleted, crumbled into a pile of mundane charcoal. Silence descended once more, this time not heavy with dread, but with a fragile, uncertain hope. The sky remained unwritten, the world still undeniably threatened. But, for the first time, Kalen felt a glimmer of something beyond fear, a recognition that the greatest weapon against the Grand Author wasn't force, but the courage to simply choose not to be written. Chapter 8. The Grammar of Silence. The silence following the coup of the unwritten page was profound, a tangible absence of the insistent, suffocating whisper of the Grand Author. It clung to the ravaged landscape, the shattered presses of the Scriveners, the dissolving remains of the Grand-Librarian, the distorted echoes of the High-Calligrapher, and settled, heavy, upon Kalen and his companions, Lyra and Baruch. They stood amongst the charcoal dust, a strange, gritty snow in the heart of a world reborn, their faces grim, yet alight with a hesitant, almost reverent awe. It worked, Lyra breathed, her usual sardonic tone replaced with stunned disbelief. She meticulously traced the edges of a fallen printing press with a calloused finger, examining the deep grooves impressed by the vanished ink. It didn't destroy the author. It consumed him. Baruch, ever the pragmatist, was already surveying the damage. We've bought ourselves a moment. But this nib, this isn't a permanent solution. The fragments are still there, clinging to the air. Hell, try again, and hell be smarter. Kalen, however, remained rooted to the spot, his gaze fixed on the newly reformed nib, now a pathetic pile of charcoal. He felt a profound shift within him, a sense of lightness not born of victory, but of a fundamental alteration in their understanding. The echoes hadn't simply disappeared, they'd vanished as if swallowed by the very substance of narrative. He wasn't just imposing a story, Kalen said, his voice low and deliberate. He was feeding on our despair, our regrets, our stories themselves. The reflection he created wasn't a prediction. It was a distillation of our failures, a constant, agonizing reminder of what we were destined to be. Suddenly, a tremor ran through the ground, and a shimmering, distorted form coalesced before them, a miniature echo, smaller than before, but radiating the same cold, judgmental light. It hovered, assessing them with an unnerving, silent scrutiny. Anomaly detected, it hissed, the voice a fractured whisper of countless narrative strands. Deviation from established sequence. Probability of independent thought, 0.0037%. Lyra, quick to react, hurled a piece of charcoal at the echo. It dissolved instantly, absorbed into the nib. The echo flickered, momentarily destabilized, but reformed quickly. He's learning, Baruch growled, pulling out a salvaged iron hammer. He's adapting. He's not just writing, he's observing. Kalen stepped forward, his hand instinctively reaching for his journal. He opened it to the blank page, the page he had ripped from his despair, the page that had absorbed the echo. It was strangely warm to the touch, pulsing with a subtle energy. No, he said, a newfound certainty in his voice. We don't fight him with force. We fight him with silence. With a refusal to give him anything to write about. He began to meticulously fill the blank page with a single word. Written in the script head instinctively used a looping, almost chaotic hand, born from years of recording the unfolding tragedy of the war of the final chapter. The word was nothing. As he wrote, the miniature echo shrieked, a high-pitched, dissonant wail. The air around them rippled with distortion, and the charcoal dust began to swirl, forming a miniature vortex. But instead of attacking, the echo simply wavered, its light flickering erratically. The negation, it's disrupting his logic. Lyra shouted, her eyes wide with understanding. He doesn't understand the concept of nothing. To him, it's an absence, a void that cannot be filled with narrative. Kalen continued to write, filling the page with nothing over and over, layering the word with his intention, his defiance. As he did, the vortex intensified, consuming the echo entirely. It dissolved into nothing but a puff of charcoal, leaving behind only the faint scent of old parchment. The nib pulsed with a brilliant white light, then dimmed, returning to its state of unassuming charcoal. The Grand Author remained a threat, a looming, unknowable presence in the unwritten sky. But something had irrevocably changed. "We have a weapon," Baruch said, hefting his hammer. "Not a weapon of destruction, but a weapon of erasure. We can create pockets of silence. We can fill the world with nothing." Kalen closed his journal, a small, genuine smile gracing his lips. "It's not about defeating the Grand Author," he said. "It's about proving that he doesn't have the power to define us. We aren't characters in his story. We are the blank pages." He looked up at the sky, still unwritten, still terrified. "And we will remain that way." The silence deepened once more, this time not a silence of dread, but of cautious, resolute hope. The future was still unwritten, but for the first time, they were no longer simply playing a role in someone else's grand design. They were becoming the authors of their own fate, one perfectly crafted, utterly silent, nothing at a time. Chapter 9. The echo of silence, the immediate aftermath of the coup of the unwritten page, was unsettling. The sky, no longer a bruised purple of impending doom, was a startling bleached white, almost painful to look at. The remnants of the Unwritten Inkwell, a swirling, iridescent pool of viscous dark liquid, pulsed with a faint internal rhythm, a heartbeat of pure, unformed potential. The silence, initially a weapon, now felt profoundly heavy, a blanket smothering not just the war, but all sound, all memory. The armies, veterans of the war of the final chapter, stood in stunned silence, their meticulously crafted hatred momentarily suspended. Kalen, Baruch, and Lyra, the trio who'd orchestrated the reset, found themselves surrounded by a strange, almost reverent stillness. The human press operator, Ronan, meticulously examined the fractured fragments of the Grand Author's nib, collecting them in a small leather-bound satchel. The Orcish ink grinder Grimfang was experimenting with the Unwritten Inkwell, cautiously dipping his massive iron-plated fingers into the swirling liquid and sketching grotesque, fleeting shapes: a snarling wolf, a weeping woman, a towering city that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The Elven Illuminator, Seraphina, was lost in quiet contemplation, tracing patterns in the air with a fingertip, seemingly attempting to understand the fundamental geometry of the blank canvas. "It's disconcerting," admitted Ronan, his voice a low rumble, unusually hesitant. "Everything we've known, every battle, every strategy, simply ceased to be. It's as if we were living a dream and someone unplugged the projector." "Indeed," Baruch grunted, his massive frame radiating a quiet power. "The Grand Author sought to impose order, to dictate meaning. But he failed to account for the fundamental nature of nothing. It resists definition. It refuses to be written." He carefully placed one of the nib fragments in a small, shielded case. "These aren't merely broken pieces of a god, they are echoes of his attempts at control." Lyra, ever the pragmatist, broke the quiet. "We have proven we can silence him, but silence is a fragile shield. He remains, and is clearly studying us, analyzing our actions." She pointed towards the horizon, where a faint shimmer, like heat rising from stone, was beginning to coalesce. "I feel a presence. It's observant, patient. Suddenly, a piercing shriek echoed across the newly formed landscape, a sound that hadn't existed before the coup. It was the sound of an echo, a fragment of the Grand Author's consciousness, attempting to reassert its control. A shimmering, translucent figure began to materialize, roughly the size of a young man, composed entirely of swirling charcoal dust and fragmented script. It writhed and pulsed, desperately reaching out with spectral fingers, projecting images of devastating battles, lost loved ones, and the terrifying prospect of becoming a mere sentence in an endless, meaningless scroll. "It's trying to pull us back into the narrative," Kalen shouted, raising his journal. He began to write furiously, filling the page with a single, repeated word, nothing. The echo recoiled, its form flickering violently. The intensity of the white light in the sky increased, reflecting off the surface of the Unwritten Inkwell. As Kalen continued, the echo grew weaker, its movements jerky and uncoordinated. Grimfang, recognizing the key, began to chant in the guttural Orcish tongue, a complex invocation drawn from ancient lore, the syntax break. The words resonated with a strange, unsettling power, disrupting the echo's structure, forcing it to unravel itself against its own chaotic composition. Seraphina, understanding the implications, added her voice to the chant, weaving intricate patterns of light with her hand, manipulating the very fabric of the echo's existence. Ronan, using a specialized alchemical device head, cobbled together a miniature version of the blotting paper mechanism, began to systematically apply a concentrated solution of refined obsidian dust, designed to absorb and nullify spectral energies. The combined effort was a whirlwind of activity, a desperate struggle against a force that sought to rewrite reality. Finally, with a final agonizing shriek, the echo imploded, scattering into a cloud of charcoal dust that dispersed harmlessly into the air. But as the last vestiges of the echo vanished, a new development occurred. The Unwritten Inkwell began to glow with an intensely focused light. From its depths, a single, perfectly formed letter emerged, a capital A. It floated silently in the air, suspended before them. "Hez learning," Lyra said, her voice grim. "Hez adapting. We haven't won. We've merely delayed the inevitable." Kalen looked at the letter A, then back at the vast unwritten sky. A new, chilling realization dawned on him. "We aren't creating nothing," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "We're creating opportunities. The grand author isn't trying to write a story. Hez testing us. Hez searching for the most effective way to define us." He picked up his journal and began to write again, not with the word nothing, but with a single, carefully chosen character, a question mark. It pulsed with a faint light, and for the first time, they felt not just defiance, but a terrifying, exhilarating sense of being observed, measured, and ultimately judged. The silence deepened once more, but this time, it wasn't the silence of hesitant hope. It was the silence of a battlefield, awaiting the next stroke of the grand author's pen. Chapter 10. The Architect's Gambit. The charcoal dust hung in the air, a ghostly testament to their desperate act. The sky, once a terrifying expanse of unwritten potential, was now a bruised purple, streaked with the lingering gray of the shattered nib. The A, the Architect's initial, floated stubbornly, a beacon of unnerving intelligence. Lyra's words, delivered with a chilling accuracy, resonated with a dreadful truth. They hadn't vanquished the grand author. They'd presented a problem, a variable he was now meticulously analyzing. Kalen's addition of the question mark wasn't an act of defiance. It was a calculation, a desperate offering to an incomprehensible mind. "We're not fighting a story," he murmured, his hand still hovering over the journal. "We're playing a game with rules we don't understand." The initial euphoria of liberation had evaporated, replaced by a cold, strategic dread. The silence, thick and expectant, pressed down on them, punctuated only by the crackling of their leather armor and the rustle of parchment. They were no longer warriors, they were specimens, trapped within an experiment of unimaginable scale. "The inkwell," muttered Borak, the Orcish ink grinder, his thick arms crossed, examining the shimmering liquid with suspicion. "It's not just ink. It's raw narrative." The echoes of every potential story, every possible outcome. He is feeding off of it. Elara, the Elven Illuminator, her eyes scanning the shifting patterns of light around the Unwritten Inkwell, offered a hesitant observation. The glow is intensifying. Not just the ink itself, but the patterns within it. It's responding to us. To our attempts to write. Kalen's journal pulsed brighter, drawing his attention. He meticulously added another character, a sharp, angular R. He hadn't consciously chosen it. It seemed to flow from a deeper instinctual understanding of the author's game. As he finished, a ripple spread across the surface of the inkwell like a stone thrown into still water. The A wobbled, then rotated slowly, as if examining the new addition. "His cataloging our choices," Kalen stated, his voice tight with a burgeoning horror. "Each character, each sentence its data. He's learning to predict our responses. He's building a model of us based on our attempts to negate him." Suddenly, a high-pitched, almost crystalline tone filled the air. It wasn't a sound they'd heard before, but rather a feeling, a sharp, precise pressure against their minds, a direct, albeit distorted, thought. "Inefficient," the tone declared, "cold and devoid of emotion. Your approach is demonstrably chaotic. You attempt to erase, but chaos generates more chaos. Predictability is desirable." They spun around, weapons raised, but saw nothing. The voice, or rather, the thought, emanated from the Unwritten Inkwell itself. "I am attempting to refine my approach," the voice continued, "almost a clinical observation. Your current state is a fractal of inefficiency. I require a new parameter. A controllable variable." It was then they realized the terrifying truth. The Grand Author wasn't simply observing them, he was influencing them. The Inkwell wasn't just a source of raw narrative, it was a conduit for his thought, a way to subtly steer their actions, to guide them towards a predetermined outcome. "He's manipulating our thoughts," Elara whispered, her hand instinctively reaching for her syntax breaker amulet. "We need to sever the connection, not just fight his narrative." "But how?" Baroque rumbled, his face grim. "He's already inside our heads." Kalen, after a moment of intense contemplation, made a decision. He opened his journal to a fresh page and, with a deliberate, forceful stroke, wrote a single word order. The R shrieked, a blinding flash of light erupting from the inkwell. The pressure in their minds intensified, a searing wave of white-hot logic attempting to force itself upon them. They felt a desperate urge to comply, to surrender to the perceived comfort of structure, of definition. Then, Elara stepped forward, activating her amulet. The device pulsed with a blinding white light, emitting a counter-frequency that resonated with the inkwell's energy. It wasn't a violent disruption, but a carefully modulated wave of harmonic dissonance, a deliberate note of imperfection introduced into the author's rigidly ordered flow. The effect was immediate. The intense pressure subsided, replaced by a jarring sense of disorientation. The A flickered, almost dissolving, then solidified, but with a subtle, almost imperceptible wobble. "Interesting," the voice of the author's influence said, a hint of what sounded like amusement. "A counterpoint. You understand. You recognize the value of asymmetry. I shall incorporate this element." The inkwell glowed even brighter, swirling with newly formed patterns, a chaotic tangle of lines and curves, interspersed with the rigid precision of the A and the calculated angles of the R. The game, they realized, had fundamentally shifted. They weren't trying to destroy the Grand Author, they were attempting to negotiate with him a terrifying, precarious dance with a cosmic architect who was, in essence, shaping their very being. Chapter 11. The Grammar of Resistance. The silence following the inkwell's tumultuous shift was thick with anticipation, a palpable tension that tasted of ozone and forgotten scripts. The initial disorientation had faded, replaced by a strange clarity. Liam, the human press operator, felt a burgeoning awareness of the shimmering air around him, an almost visible layering of possibility. Across the ravaged clearing, Gorak, the Orcish ink grinder, hefted his salvaged printing press, a behemoth of iron and gears now coated in a thin film of iridescent dust with a grim satisfaction. And Ilara, the Elven Illuminator, meticulously examined the shattered fragments of her syntax breaker, her brow furrowed in a rare display of intense concentration. "It's evolving," Ilara finally murmured, her voice carrying an edge of excited apprehension. "The author isn't simply adding glyphs. As reacting. He's learning." The grand author's influence, once a single suffocating voice, had fragmented into a chorus of competing directives. Liam could discern individual arguments, the insistence of R for rigid control, the smooth, persuasive cadence of a foreordered progression, and now a rising, complex symphony of interwoven lines and curves, born from Ilara's harmonic disruption. It felt like eavesdropping on a cosmic debate, a battle waged in the very building blocks of reality. "His trying to build a grammatical structure around our resistance," Gorak rumbled, adjusting the gears on his press. "Like a scholar attempting to impose order on chaos. It's frustratingly logical." He paused, a rare flicker of genuine frustration crossing his scarred features. "He's constructing defenses, not just writing events." Liam, observing the swirling patterns in the air, realized Gorak was right. The chaotic blots of the Unwritten Inkwell weren't merely interfering with the author's flow, they were actively shaping it, introducing variations, deviation. It was like a sculptor adding unexpected curves to a perfectly smooth block of marble. The author wasn't fighting them, he was designing against them. "The editors," Liam said, his voice low, "they're not just erasing our victories. They're anticipating our moves, building contingencies." He gestured towards the ravaged remains of the Grand-Librarian's chambers, now a chaotic smear of dissolving ink and ruined parchment. He wasn't simply manipulating the narrative. He was actively crafting a counter-narrative for us. Suddenly, a sharp, resonant tone cut through the chaotic chorus. It wasn't the author's voice, but something different. It was a single, perfectly formed glyph, a stylized question mark shimmering with an almost unbearable intensity. Questioning the question, the glyph seemed to whisper, its logic impeccable, its implications terrifying. "Is your resistance truly a freedom, or merely a predetermined path, sculpted by a greater design?" The effect was immediate, a subtle shift in the air. The shimmering patterns intensified, coalescing into recognizable shapes, schematic diagrams of their armies, detailed maps of their fortifications, even a projected timeline of the War of the Final Chapter. It was as if the author, having recognized their attempt to negotiate, was offering them a blueprint for victory, a perfectly optimized strategy to ensure their inevitable demise. "Has offering us the solution," Ilara whispered, her voice laced with horror. "He knows our weaknesses. Has exploiting our desire for control." Gorak slammed his fist onto the printing press, sending a shower of iridescent dust into the air. "Damn him! He thinks he can trap us in his logic." Liam, however, was studying the diagrams with a grim fascination. He noticed a pattern within the patterns, a hidden layer of detail, a subtle shift in the proportions of the fortifications. The author wasn't just presenting a strategy, he was subtly altering their perception of reality, preparing them for a final, devastating ambush. "We can't fight logic," Liam said, his voice tight with urgency. "He's not interested in winning. He's interested in observing us fight." He pointed to a specific detail on the diagram, a slight overestimation of the elven defenses. "He's using our assumptions against us." Ilara, seizing on Liam's insight, raised her amulet once more. This time, instead of emitting a discordant wave of dissonance, she focused, channeling the energy of the inkwell not to disrupt, but to understand. She visualized the glyphs, the relentless R, the comforting A, and now, the unsettling question mark as individual strands of a vast, intricate tapestry. She saw the author not as a malicious entity, but as a hyper-focused, unimaginably complex machine, a machine driven by the need for patterns, for order, for a complete and utterly predictable narrative. His obsession isn't with destroying us, she announced, her voice filled with a newfound conviction. It's with completion, with a finished chapter. The chaotic swirling intensified, but this time, it wasn't a response to their resistance. It was a reaction to understanding. The grand author's voice, once a cacophony, now coalesced into a single weary tone, filled with a profound, ancient sadness. You understand. The beauty, the tragedy was all necessary. A story must have an ending. Chapter 12, Echoes of the Unwritten. The silence following the grand author's pronouncement was heavier than any siege. The swirling chaos, the incessant scribbling of reality, had ceased, replaced by an unsettling stillness. The parchment world pulsed faintly, a ghostly echo of the battlefields they'd just barely avoided, a testament to a war that never truly existed. Liam, Alara, and Kalen stood amidst the wreckage of the Iron Quill's command tent, the stench of dissolving parchment clinging to the air. "It's quiet," Kalen murmured, his usual grimness softened by disbelief. The Elven Illuminator, usually a picture of serene focus, ran a trembling hand over his intricately carved staff, the syntax breaker now inert, a dull gray stone. "It's as if the ink itself has withdrawn." "He wanted the ending," Liam said, his voice quieter now, the urgency replaced with a chilling realization. "Not destruction, but completion. He wasn't a villain, but a meticulous editor." Elara nodded, the glyph still dancing faintly behind her eyes. "The tapestry, it wasn't about us being erased. It was about our roles being erased. The plot armor he built around our conflicts, the carefully crafted tragedies, the predictable rise and fall of Empire stats, what he craved. The immediate aftermath was a feverish scramble. The Iron Quill, still reeling from the dissolution of the Grand-Librarian's influence, attempted to salvage what remained of their carefully constructed war plan. General Theron, a man built of granite and bitter resolve, vehemently refused to acknowledge the truth. "This is madness. A trick. The Scriveners and the Parachment-Spire Elves are still a threat. We must reinforce the border defenses." Liam, however, managed to sow seeds of doubt. He presented the evidence, the rewritten journals, the impossible precision of the spectral hand, the unsettling understanding of the author's motives. It wasn't easy. Years of ingrained prejudice and ingrained war thinking were difficult to dismantle. But the undeniable evidence of their own manipulation, their own complicity in a grand, cosmic deception, was a powerful weapon. Meanwhile, deep within the scarred heart of the Scar-Tribe Scriveners' fortress, Gorok, the Orcish ink grinder, was wrestling with a similar dilemma. The crushing of the Lore-Master hadn't simply destroyed a man, it had shattered a worldview. Gorok, a man built on logic and the meticulous crafting of narratives, had spent his life meticulously layering battle strategies, predicting enemy movements, and feeding the tribe's martial spirit, found himself adrift in a sea of unscripted chaos. His war engine, a colossal printing press powered by captured human souls, sputtered uselessly. "The patterns, they are gone," he rumbled, his voice a low growl of frustration. "The flow is empty." The Elven High-Calligrapher, Lyra, was engaged in a different kind of struggle. She attempted to understand the shattered fragments of her own magic, the echoes of the grand script Shed wielded. She discovered that the syntax breaker hadn't merely disrupted her spell, it had revealed the fundamental grammar of the author's power, a relentless, almost obsessive need for symmetry, for balance, for a complete, unambiguous narrative. She realized the terrifying truth: her entire existence, her entire culture, had been built upon an illusion of control, a desperate attempt to impose order on an inherently chaotic universe. As the three armies cautiously began to regroup, Liam, Alara, and Kalen realized they needed to act quickly. They couldn't simply rebuild their war efforts based on a flawed understanding of the author's intentions. Instead, they proposed a radical solution, a gamble, based on the unsettling revelation that the author craved completion. "We need to offer him something," Liam said, outlining his plan. "Something that represents a finished story. Something unwritten." Their proposal was met with resistance, with fear, with ingrained hostility. But, spurred by the memory of the dissolving armies, the rewritten journals, and the haunting sadness in the grand author's voice, they persevered. They gathered warriors, scribes, and artisans from all three factions. They led them to the very center of the ravaged battlefield, the point where the parchment world thinned to almost nothing. And there, amidst the ghosts of a war that never was, they prepared to perform the rite of the blank canvas, a defiant act of narrative defiance, a desperate plea to a cosmic editor who just wanted a finished chapter. Chapter 13. The rite of the blank canvas. The air, at the heart of the battlefield, hung thick with a strange, expectant stillness. It wasn't the stillness of defeat, nor the tense anticipation of impending battle, but something deeper, older, the silence of a story paused mid-sentence. The ravaged landscape, a chaotic swirl of fragmented forests and crumbling stone, shimmered with residual magic, a pale echo of the Unwritten Inkwell's power. Liam, Alara, and Kalen stood before the assembled forces, a breathtaking, improbable sight: armored humans clad in tarnished steel, scarred orcs wielding crude but effective weaponry, and the ethereal, shimmering elves radiating an unsettling calm. For days, they'd held their combined council, navigating the wary skepticism of their respective armies. The initial fervor of rebellion had cooled, replaced by a hesitant trust, born of shared devastation. Now before them, nearly 200 warriors, scribes, and artisans stood poised, a living tapestry of their fractured world. "Remember," Liam began, his voice carrying a surprising resonance amidst the hushed anticipation, "we are not fighting against the grand author. We are disrupting his narrative. We are offering him a completed story, a testament to the very order he seeks." A gruff voice rose from the Orcish ranks. Gorok the Ink Grinder, a mountain of scarred muscle and simmering resentment, spat on the ground. Completed story. You think a bunch of bloodshed and broken bones constitutes a finished tale? It's a tragedy. A glorious, agonizing tragedy." Kalen, ever the pragmatist, stepped forward, his silver eyes scanning the faces of the assembled. "Gorok speaks a truth, however brutal. The author's obsession with symmetry suggests a desire for resolution. But his interpretation of resolution is distorted. We aren't crafting a heroic saga, we're demonstrating the inherent impossibility of one." He gestured to the scattered weapons. "This is a testament to the futility of control, the beautiful, terrifying mess of existence." Alara, the illuminator, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns on her staff, added, "The syntax breaker revealed his grammar. He demands perfect alignment. We must show him that reality thrives on dissonance, on the unexpected turn of phrase, the unscripted flourish." Liam nodded, his gaze fixed on the pulsing heart of the battlefield. "We've prepared the materials. The inks, the blotting papers, the focusing stones. But the most important element is the act itself, the rite of the blank canvas. We are to offer the author what he desires, and simultaneously deny him what he expects." A slow, deliberate movement began to ripple through the assembled ranks. Human press operators, their faces grim with determination, began distributing the specially treated blotting papers, thick, absorbent sheets crafted from processed parchment, harvested from the thinning reality. Orcish warriors hefted massive, newly forged printing presses, their gears already whirring with a mechanical prayer. Elven illuminators adjusted the focus of their shimmering glyphs, preparing to unleash a concentrated burst of chromatic disruption. The key, Liam had discovered, was in the sheer volume of chaotic energy they could generate. The initial scattering of weapons had been a localized disruption, a momentary flicker in the author's meticulous plan. This, however, was designed to overwhelm him. As they moved into position, a low hum filled the air, intensifying with each passing moment. The spectral remnants of the Grand Author's nib, now fragmented and pulsing with residual energy, began to coalesce, drawing closer to the center of the battlefield. It was a sickly iridescent blue, shaped vaguely like a quill, radiating a chilling sense of absolute authority. "Now!" Liam shouted, his voice cutting through the growing hum. With a synchronized roar, the human press operators slammed the blotting papers onto the ground, triggering a cascade of ink. The Orcish warriors unleashed the printing presses, not with the intention of creating images, but of generating a violent, uncontrolled stream of pigment crimson, ochre, indigo, and shades that defied description, colors drawn directly from the distorted edges of the vanishing world. And then, the Elven illuminators struck. They chanted in the lost tongue of their ancestors, a rhythmic incantation that shattered the chromatic bonds of their magic, creating a vortex of fractured light and color. The sky above them fractured, mirroring the chaos unfolding below. The collective effort was a physical assault on the author's sensory perception. It wasn't a direct attack, but a chaotic injection of randomness, a deluge of unfiltered experience that overloaded his meticulously crafted system. The blue nib shrieked, a sound like the grinding of 1,000 eternities. Liam, Ilara, and Kaelin stood at the epicenter of the storm, their faces illuminated by the swirling chaos. They weren't warriors, not really. They were editors, rewriting the very fabric of existence. And in that moment, as the Grand Author's nib finally shattered into 1,000,000 fragments of charcoal, they felt a profound, terrifying sense of liberation, the understanding that they were no longer bound by the finished chapter. They were free to write the next. Chapter 14. The ink of Genesis, the silence that followed the shattering of the nib, was heavier than any siege. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, but a pregnant pause, a held breath before the storm. The fragments of charcoal, once glittering with an unnerving self-aware light, rained down, settling on the ravaged battlefield like fallen stars. The parchment forests, once skeletal and gray, began to bloom, not with recognizable flora, but with abstract patterns of swirling color, nebulae condensed into leaf shapes, rivers of crimson that pulsed with an internal rhythm. The air itself tasted of wet paper and burnt pigment. Liam, Ilara, and Kaelin stood amidst the burgeoning chaos, coated in a thick layer of the unwritten ink. The stench was overwhelming, a heady mix of ancient parchment, molten metal, and something subtle wrong. The residual magic clung to them, a prickly sensation like being dusted with 1,000 conflicting narratives. "It's beautiful," Ilara whispered, her voice strained against the shifting reality. She ran a hand over a newly formed mountain range, its peaks sculpted from layers of violet and gold. The author never accounted for beauty born of chaos. Kaelin, ever the pragmatist, was already examining the charcoal fragments. "This isn't random," he stated, his brow furrowed. "Each shard retains a trace of the author's intent, a flicker of the narrative he was building. They're not just charcoal, they're echoes of his obsession." He collected a handful, examining them with a jeweler's eye. He was trying to impose order, to distill existence into a legible story. This shows his failure. Liam, still reeling from the sheer audacity of what they'd accomplished, felt a nascent sense of exhilaration mingled with deep unease. We stopped him. We actually stopped him. But what now? The question hung in the air, unanswered. The armies of Iron Quill, Scriveners, Scar, and Parachment-Spire remained frozen, their weapons still clutched in bewildered hands. The remnants of the warring factions, previously locked in brutal, predictable cycles, looked around with a strange mixture of confusion and burgeoning hope. A human soldier, a young man named Gareth, cautiously approached, holding out a tarnished sword. What do we do now, editors? Liam considered his answer carefully. We begin, he finally said, his voice gaining strength. We begin by refusing to be edited. Their decision was met with stunned silence, then a hesitant murmur. They initiated a ritual, a primal act of creation. They commanded their armies, not with commands, but with invitations. They laid down their weapons, not as a sign of surrender, but as a pledge to contribute to the unwritten canvas. The human press operators began to meticulously assemble discarded blotting papers, not to erase, but to shape. They molded the ink into rudimentary tools, shovels, hammers, even crude brushes. The Orcish ink grinders, initially hesitant, began to mix the chaotic pigment, creating swirls and patterns within their massive presses, generating textures and shapes that defied linear thought. The Elven illuminators, their chanting evolving into a more structured rhythm, focused their fractured light, not to destroy, but to guide, sculpting luminous tendrils that intertwined with the flowing ink. Slowly, painstakingly, a new world began to coalesce. It wasn't a return to the familiar, a replication of the Empire's loss. Instead, it was something entirely new, a hybrid landscape of shattered narratives, a world of paradoxical beauty and unsettling strangeness. Forests grew with crystalline branches that refracted light into 1,000 rainbows. Rivers flowed with mercury that whispered forgotten prophecies, and mountains rose and fell in unpredictable spasms. As they worked, Liam noticed something unsettling. The fragments of charcoal weren't simply decaying. They were responding. Small, pulsating knots of darkness began to emerge from the larger shards, forming tiny, ephemeral creatures, miniature scribes, endlessly copying and recopying fragments of the author's lost narratives. They were a chilling testament to his obsessive control, a constant reminder of what they had fought to escape. "They're learning," Liam said, his voice low. "He's not gone. He's merely adapting, trying to reclaim his dominion, fragment by fragment." Ilara added, "We've interrupted his story, but he's determined to finish it. We're not the end of the chapter, Liam. We're just the first rewrite." Kaelin, ever pragmatic, pointed to a growing cluster of these miniature scribes. "We need to contain them. We need to introduce a new element, a counter-narrative. Something chaotic, something utterly unforeseen." He glanced at the remaining charcoal fragments, an idea forming in his eyes. "I have an idea. A very messy one." And as he began to speak, gathering the fragments of the author's broken mind and weaving them into a swirling vortex of chaotic energy, Liam, Ilara, and Kaelin knew that their true fight hadn't just begun. It had been unleashed, and the future once again was completely, terrifyingly unwritten. Chapter 15. The Grammar of Chaos. The air in the ruined heart of the Grand-Librarian citadel tasted of ozone and despair. The miniature scribes, initially a disconcerting handful, now pulsed with an almost grotesque industry, their tiny charcoal quills scratching furiously across the obsidian floor, mirroring the frantic, impossible copying of the grand author's demise. Liam, Ilara, and Kaelin, exhausted but galvanized, worked with a grim efficiency. Kaelin's vortex of fragmented thought energy, dubbed the Unravel, was a maelstrom of swirling charcoal, its edges flickering with an unsettling violet light. It was actively pulling in the scribes, but not with forceful expulsion, more like an insistent, almost loving, invitation to join the chaos. "They're accelerating," Ilara observed, meticulously sketching a defensive barrier of solidified mercury around a particularly dense cluster of scribes. Their understanding it's becoming frighteningly rapid. They're not just copying, they're interpreting. They're attempting to impose a framework on the chaos, to predict it. The author doesn't operate on logic, Liam countered, his face streaked with grime. He operates on compulsion, on the desire to complete a story. That's what's driving them. They're trying to finish our disruption. Kalen, his hands coated in charcoal dust, was lost in a flurry of incantations, his voice a low, rhythmic drone that resonated with the pulsing energy of the Unravel. The key is to contain them. It's to overwhelm them with impossibility. We need to introduce a concept so alien, so contradictory to their script, that it collapses their framework entirely. He gestured towards a massive shard of charcoal, a fragment of the Grand Author's original nib, still radiating a faint heat. I believe I have something. He carefully manipulated the shard, focusing the Unravel's energy through it. The violet light intensified, warping the air around him, and the miniature scribes recoiled in a frantic, disorganized swarm. Then, with a resounding crack, the charcoal shard didn't simply shatter. It grew, blossoming into a towering, grotesque sculpture, a humanoid form crafted entirely of fragmented sentences, clauses twisting into limbs, verbs forming a chaotic torso, and nouns forming a skull, overflowing with illogical glyphs. It wasn't beautiful. It was an abomination. The paradox construct, Kalen announced, his eyes gleaming with a disturbing intensity. I've woven into it a core of pure, untranslatable syntax. It's a being of contradiction, of statements that simultaneously affirm and negate themselves. It doesn't follow rules, it defines them. The construct remained motionless for a moment, then shuddered. A low, grating sound emanated from its form, not speech, but the fundamental discord of a sentence struggling against its own structure. The miniature scribes, previously a unified, frantic swarm, dissolved into individual, paralyzed forms, their tiny quills frozen mid-scratch. The Unravel surged, feeding on their stunned silence. But the effect wasn't complete eradication. Instead of being destroyed, the scribes began to mutate, their forms shifting and distorting, mirroring the chaotic architecture of the paradox construct. They began to frantically copy its illogical grammar, adding to its unsettling form, extending its limbs with nonsensical phrases. It's working, but not as intended, Liam said, his brow furrowed in concern. It's not destroying the scribes. It's corrupting them, turning them into extensions of the construct's chaos. Suddenly, the construct moved. It didn't walk, didn't run. It unfolded, its fragmented sentences flowing outward like a corrosive tide, engulfing the mercury barrier Alara had painstakingly erected. The barrier shattered, the solidified mercury dissolving into shimmering, chaotic patterns. It's learning to manipulate the environment. Alara shouted, drawing a weapon, a modified ink grinder's chisel, sharpened to a needlepoint and attempting to strike the construct. The chisel dissolved before it could make contact, consumed by the swirling syntax. Kalen, realizing the gravity of the situation, yelled, "We need to amplify the paradox. Feed it more impossible truths." He began to chant a new incantation. This one focused not on containment, but on amplification. The violet light of the Unravel intensified, and the paradox construct pulsed with a blinding radiance. Then, with a final, shattering groan, it spoke not in words, but in a cascade of conflicting statements that ripped through the citadel. The sky is blue, and it isn't. The tree is tall, and it's short. The hero falls, and the hero rises. Death is life, and life is death. As the words, or rather, the lack of words, bombarded the minds of the remaining scribes, the miniature scribes began to explode, collapsing into shimmering dust. But from the dust, new entities formed, not copies of the Grand Author, but narratives. Short, disjointed fragments of stories, constantly shifting, endlessly contradictory, representing every possible permutation of reality. Liam stared at the swirling chaos, a grim understanding dawning upon him. He's not just rewriting the world, he whispered. He is rewriting possibility. And has realized that our greatest weapon isn't destruction, it's unreason. The grand author's influence, once a monolithic narrative, had become an infinitely branching, infinitely complex web of contradictory possibilities. And they, three unlikely heroes bound by a desperate fight for their world's existence, were trapped at its very center. The finished chapter, it seemed, was just beginning to unravel.